I'm going to get started. So welcome to the Down Syndrome Association webinar on delivering effective inclusion and adaptations in the classroom for learners who have Down syndrome. A lot of the content from today will also be relevant for pupils with other learning disabilities as well. If you have got any technical issues, please could you use the chat to let us know. I can see that Helen has her hand up. If she could use the chat, that would be really helpful. Thank you. So the purpose of the session today is to provide support and information to education professionals working in early years, school, college, and other staff, people who are working with pupils who have Down syndrome, to give you some information and advice about the approaches that you might want to take to support adaptation and differentiation within the classroom for learners who have Down syndrome. We've had a lot of requests for this over the years, but we're responding specifically to a request from our affiliated groups. So the Down Syndrome Association has a number of affiliated local support groups, and I met with them a little while ago, and they specifically asked if we could host a webinar and provide some information about differentiation. So we're responding to that request today. And we are here to answer your questions and to provide you, hopefully, with information, ideas, and the confidence to include people who have Down syndrome in your setting. So on the agenda today, we are going to very quickly introduce ourselves. We've then got 3 presentations. We have 3 speakers today. I'm chairing the session, and we have 3 speakers, each presenting for roughly 15 minutes each. Then we're going to have a panel discussion with some questions that I'm going to pose, and we'll see where that discussion leads us. And then after that, there will be time for questions and answers from the audience as well. So my name is Sharon Smith. I'm the Education Advisor for the Down Syndrome Association. And I'm joined today by Gillian Bird, who is the Services Director for the Down Syndrome Association, Sue Jagger, who is the Head of English and Literacy Coordinator at a large secondary school, and Professor Priya Lalvani, who is a mother of a young lady who has Down syndrome and is also a professor at Montclair State University in the US. So Priya's joining us from the US today, and we're delighted to have you all. Each of the speakers will be able to introduce themselves some more detail when they start their individual talks. So I am going to mute myself, and I'm going to hand over first to Gillian Bird. Jill, if you could introduce yourself a little bit more, and then over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. I'm the Services Director for the Down Syndrome Association, so I oversee all of our services. And I have over 35 years of supporting learners who have Down syndrome and teachers in inclusive education settings. The Down Syndrome Association offers training sessions, shortish online training sessions across the age range from birth to 4, and then 4 to 11 primary, and then secondary. And we also can offer bespoke college online sessions if you want those. Okay, we have a large number of resources on the website, a huge number on our education page, and they have, if you haven't looked for a while, if you're regulars and haven't looked for a while, they have increased a lot in the last year following an education campaign where we created lots of new resources. Actually, one of those is a kind of basic primary education set of slides, although you won't have the verbal presentation that goes with it, but it has a few examples of children's work and some key points on it. Now I'm expecting many of you to be able to tell me some of the common associated characteristics that associated with having Down syndrome. So I'm not doing a lot about that, but if I was to ask you, you probably could come up with, what vision and hearing, and for everybody, basic of having things big enough, clear enough, bold enough, writing in black felt pen, understanding what those vision issues are for everybody, as well as their own particular vision issues in addition to that. And we have a superb recording with Dr. Margaret Woodhouse and a parent that explains that. That's in the education resources too. And of course, any other management of any other sensory needs or health conditions, the increased likelihood of having Down syndrome with autism, and a need for speech and language therapy and activities to promote speech, language and communication skills, and taking into account verbal working memory and manipulation of information in working memory, some things to know about that. And also having an intellectual disability that may be linked with that, or learning disability, and an understanding of what that means or what that may mean. And then common strengths for learners with using visual supports or visual spatial supports, and including the written word, and learning by imitation with models to copy in various ways. And then common areas of achievement for everybody, actually, regardless of how their development is progressing at a level. They can have very complex needs and still be able to read a bit, at a level, and understand a bit. So reading, IT, frequently visual arts, but we don't want to limit them to those things. But you do, it's not everybody who has these things, but they're common. And using, visual tools and calculators and other equipment and other ways to overcome what may be barriers for individuals. And I'm sure we will all talk about, there's that bit to know, but everybody's needs are individual, and learners are all very different interests, different everything. So it's about appreciating individual needs. And what I wanted to talk about this afternoon was just a few tips, bits of advice, and I've chosen supporting and developing attention skills for particular parts of the lesson. And I'm thinking of the little ones to begin with, and parts of lessons, stages of lessons, and starting off with whole class teacher-led presentations. And for infants, the usual common way of doing that is to have a whiteboard that is drawn on with a marker pen, to try to pick out aspects of what the teacher's saying or showing, if it's a little way away from you, to keep you attending to that. Yeah. And I wanted to say that for all, and you'll see I've listed other things there, but for all of those things, what I'd suggest you try and avoid is talking, if you're an assistant supporting the child and supporting them with the manipulatives or whiteboard or the other things there, not to talk or try not to talk when the teacher's talking, because we want the child to learn to attend and to what the teacher's saying. So you can almost, as an assistant, try and cue them in to that. But you can also show them, pictures or written words, or draw things on whiteboards, but try not to run your own simultaneous verbal lesson, or you will not be allowing the child to learn to follow the teacher at the front. And we, with quite young children, attention to following somebody at the front of the class is a difficult attention skill, and we need to teach them how to do that. So I put some manipulatives up there. You can pass things over, you can draw things, you can have a printed copy of whatever the teacher's showing or talking about, or you could have a laptop, or if it's a screen presentation, something closer. But try not to over talk the teacher and run a separate lesson, because you're stopping that attention skill from developing. And of course, skills will develop with increasing age, and we want to see that happening. The example with the pictures of the Titanic, that is a listening support book. So it's not a record book. It's not for the child or anybody to write in. It is that if you have a series of lessons on any topic at all, and of course you do, lots of subjects, you can prepare pictures with written words. And you can, while a presentation's going on, well, actually, some of the junior age children just look through it or find things that they've heard the teacher talking about, but you could cue them into things with looking or pointing as well. So listening support book to help with attention to what's being spoken about. And then I've put some other things that are more about during activities, any activities, not that whole class presentation. I put about the importance of finding some independent tasks that the child can do on his or her own. And they are always there, and they have to be able to do them fairly easily. Well, you know what an independent task is, without needing your help, and get away from them to do that. That's good for your attention. So look for those, find those, and build them in, and really value them. Because we want children to have the opportunity to enjoy what they're doing. And well, they may enjoy you talking and guiding them, teaching them all the time, but they may not enjoy that. We want things to become intrinsically motivating. So find those. I've put too much talking in inverted commas. That was actually one of the things that came out from some research by Sarah Geiger, an educational psychologist, where she worked with children and young people who had Down syndrome to find out what they liked or didn't. And she worked with their teachers and parents too, but particularly interesting with the learners, what they liked about school. One of the things that came out was them saying there was too much talking sometimes, and that was difficult. So I just wanted to mention that, you know, as well as good educational reasons why, although we do want to guide them, if you are, it's hard if people are talking too much. They don't actually have time to process or understand or think for themselves. So just be aware of that mixture. And of course, I'm thinking of the little ones now. If somebody has fast attention, or we might call it short attention, but if they're going fast, you have to go fast too. So you have to have a range of short things ready to match their attention skills to hold it. And then you're going to gradually build it up from there. So do have your activities ready, because if you have to get up and go and get them, so might they go and do something else instead. And changing levels of activity, from easy tasks to more difficult tasks, and providing actual breaks. So getting up and moving if you need to. You may not need to do these things, but if you need to. And I put in take a photo as one nice example of a child in primary school who and our children do have photos often of what they're doing or what their activities are, and they like putting those in record books or being helped to do so, and they like revising those, whether they're topic words or things they've done. It's a good way of learning. They like to go back through it, and of course, if you know things have gone as far as they have for the moment, that's a great opportunity to say, oh, I think we need a photo now. They can get up and move around and take a photo. But there's, you know, hundreds of ways that you can build in kind of little breaks that are helpful. I also put in about accumulative rewards and motivators examples. And by accumulative, I mean, not just you'll get a reward and that's shown on your timetable, but some kind of, as used to be called, token or marker. So you can build up to something. And if you need to, you can just hand those over often without interrupting what's going on for the learner. And I've got lovely examples that I could recall for you, based on children's personal interests. One in particular was a child who liked, oh, I'm on a Doctor Who theme now, Daleks. So he had a life-size Dalek on the room, and Daleks have spots, don't they? So he could collect the spots and then have a little break in it. At some point he could go and put them on his Dalek, and when he had his Dalek full, there was another reward that went with that. And I've also, thinking of secondary age, I've seen lovely social storybooks made about the interest of the child. And the one that comes to mind happens to be a Doctor Who and the Cyberman example. And it was about touching and the Cybermen coming down and finding Doctor Who. Anyway, it was really a bit of fun, but it worked because it was interesting and it was fun and it worked. Right. Also,
2 minutes, Jill.
2 minutes. On that, just to quickly say, I've said it will change with age. And if you like, there's kind of learning behaviours and knowing what happens at school and in classes and how to attend and at all the different stages and parts of the lesson, that will really increase. And it's for that reason that I often say that please don't think that including is going to become more difficult. For these reasons that I've already spoken about some of these skills that will develop, I would say it's more difficult when you have littler ones. There are other things you need to do with older children around probably the adaptations for the activities, but in many ways you have a pupil who's just so much more similar to other pupils, apart from the things that we know about, having a learning disability and needing things being explained and activities to do and be part of with their class. If I have 1 minute, I put in expressing oneself and behaviour, just to highlight that many of our children and young people either can't or don't. I think they maybe could, but they don't think they're supposed to really sometimes say what's worrying them or what's bothering them or what they do and what they don't like. And that can lead to consequences for behaviour that could so easily be sorted out if they were able to do that. So we need to practice that from quite young, I'd say 7-ish, that it's okay to like things and it's okay to not like things. And we all do that and it's no big deal and they're not going to get into trouble. We need them to tell us if they don't like particular members of staff, and other children probably would, or do that more easily and would have their preferred people around them supporting them. And we have a listen to me resource, communication resource. I put a couple of things that are in it there. Do have a look at that. It's got explanation as to how to use that and practice that. That'll be really helpful for finding out things that they may not say and may lead to issues. Okay, and then just finally, I put thoughts on activities in and out. That is really to say that, we do sometimes have children doing activities, don't they? And them extra, their daily practice structured activities. It's not all the same kind of classroom learning adapted, and some people go out to do those, and I just wanted a caution on those, because I have supported children who found that difficult, in that going in, coming, going out, coming in, they often have all their fun things out. That just leads to unnecessary consequences for behaviour, and sometimes have worked with people to just get them, if there have been issues around that, just get them back in all the time and have all their great, lovely things near them where they're sitting and their place in class. And that's probably enough on that. But just to say, we could talk more about this, and do come to us if you want to do that.
Thanks, Jill. Okay, I'm going to pass on next to Sue. So let me just do this. Okay. There we go. Sue, if you want to introduce yourself.
Yes, certainly. I'm just going to share a little bit about myself so that I can contextualize where my point of view and perspective is coming from, really, for this. So I am a parent of a neurodiverse teenager. Our daughter has autism with a PDA profile. And alongside that, I've been teaching for about 28 years now. I teach English currently, but I've had the privilege of teaching from foundation right up to year 13. So I've taught all the way through the spectrum, which, to be fair, has really helped me to understand how children learn and how I can support them through facilitating their learning. I'm currently head of English and head of literacy at a very large secondary school. We have about 2,000 students working with us. Just to give you a bit of context as to what our school is like, we are, as you can see from the label, we are a faith school, but we have 2,000 students. We have within our school 3 fairly large units, one for students with communication difficulties, one for hearing impaired students, and one for visually impaired students. As an English teacher, we teach mixed ability groups, and those students who join us in year 7, we have a vast range in terms of their ability levels when they're joining us. So we have some students who join us with reading ages at 16, for example, and some students who join us with reading ages of 6 years. So we have a big mixture. In English, we teach mixed ability classes. We don't teach sets. And what that means is that we have to really think very carefully about how we're delivering the curriculum, because we are a secondary school. Our students will move towards taking GCSEs. And in English, that means that they'll take GCSEs in both English language and English literature. And I will refer later on to the literature curriculum particularly, and how we enable all of our students to access Macbeth, for example, just as an example. Central to my teaching practice is really the fact that I feel that it's core to know your students. Doesn't matter which year group you're teaching, doesn't matter which subject you're teaching, the thing that we teach most is actually the child, not the subject. And I think that's really important to hold on to that, because I think September is a really busy time. We've got new classes, new challenges, new students. We're given a huge amount of information. We get given lots of, at our school, we get given profiles on students. That's really helpful because it helps us to understand maybe what their diagnosis is, maybe how a previous teacher has worked with them. But it still doesn't really show me that child until I start to work with them in the classroom. So what I would suggest is that there are 3 key things that as a classroom teacher, we really need to be doing to understand our children. They're here in the sense of observation, listening, and talk. And really, as I get used to the new classes that I've got this academic year, these are the 3 things that are really helping me to understand how I need to adapt my teaching to ensure that the children are making progress. Really, it's about me getting to know them. It's about me watching how they interact with one another, how they interact with the learning tasks they've got. Jill mentioned that some children find it tricky to go out of the classroom and then come back in. And I need to realise who that is. I need to see who that is that causes anxiety for, or who it is that works perfectly well for. So standing back and watching them for a few moments is really helpful. Listening to them is really interesting as well. The students really do have agency. They know themselves as learners. And actually realising that and trying to understand what they're saying about themselves as learners is key. So, for example, I've got a student who I know that prefers to sit in a particular seat in the classroom. That's absolutely fine. I'd like her to work with some of the other students. So what I do is I move those other students to her rather than moving her to the other students. But she still has that opportunity then to talk with them. Talking to the students, classroom's always really busy, but taking the time to talk to the students and understand what is important to them, what they enjoy, what they don't enjoy, what they find tricky, is really helpful as well. Because those three things really mean that I can understand a student, how they want to integrate into the classroom, how the classroom can be inclusive to ensure that they are included in everything, and how I can adapt what I'm doing to ensure that they have access to the same curriculum as everybody else. So on the bottom of my slides, I've just put some questions really, just as thought, just a little moment for thinking. So how do you ensure that the students are enabled within your classroom? Because I think really what we're talking about is enabling the students that we are teaching, enabling them to access Macbeth, for example. One of the most straightforward ways I think that we do adaptation in our classrooms is through the physical environment. What I think is really important is working out what our classrooms feel like. I've been in classrooms over the years that have been incredibly busy. They've got lots of things on all of the walls, and that can be too much for students. I've just put a couple of examples here of some displays in the classroom that I'm teaching in currently. They're there to engage students, and we refer to them as I'm teaching. But the classroom that we create is really our responsibility as teachers. The seating within the classroom, how we position students, whether or not we position students with their backs to one another or the backs to the board, is really important in terms of how they engage. Seating plans are interesting. They evolve and develop as the year goes on, as students become more familiar with one another, as they learn, actually, I work better with a different student or in a particular place in the classroom. They're important, and we need to have an insight into the child in order to understand where is it best for them to learn in the room. I try quite often to encourage students to talk to me about where they're sitting in the classroom and make suggestions as to where they could sit that would help them to learn, or who they could sit with that would help them to learn. As students are coming into the room, quite often we have very calm music playing as well. And it needs to be calm because there are some students who actually don't like too much music. It can be a sensory overload. But actually, if it's a nice, gentle, calm piece of music, it just gets the class into the room, enables students to settle and to sit down. And if they're used to doing that, then that's really just something that they expect, actually. There are other ways in which we can adapt our teaching, and I think the physical is a really helpful one. Something else with physical that actually then feeds into what we're doing in terms of the actual learning is things like ensuring that you've got lots of pencil cases available. So if you know that a student finds it tricky to organise themselves, and that actually at that point in time is not what you want to be focusing on, then you can have a set of pencil cases. I've got a set of pencil cases on the side in my classroom. I just put them out on the tables for those students that are going to need them immediately. So that that adaptation that I've done there for them is just, I've taken care of that. They don't need to worry about that. In terms of adapting for learning with relation to the curriculum, as a school and as an English teacher, what we do is we view inclusion as really important. Our aim is that all students have access to the curriculum that we're teaching. Doesn't matter what their particular challenges are or needs are. What we've got to do is work out how to engage them with that curriculum. I'm going to suggest, I think there's 3 ways in which we can do that. Outcome-led, task-led, and text-led. Those 3 aspects all take time to think about, but don't necessarily mean that you've got to produce lots of different resources. The main thing in the classroom really is the teacher and myself as a facilitator of learning. So it's really about how I interact with the students and their learning at the point it's taking place that's really going to help them to understand what the concepts we're talking about. So I just want to talk for a few moments about these things. So outcome is really where if you like, if I'm looking at Macbeth and I want everybody in the classroom to understand the plot of Macbeth, then my expectation for everybody is that they will understand that plot before they leave that lesson. The outcome that they produce to show me their level of understanding can be different. So it could be that the most able students in the classroom write a paragraph and refer to the text. It could be that I've got some other students in the classroom who are producing a storyboard, or it could be that I've got some students in the classroom who are producing just images and then one word underneath. But when I talk to them, they can tell me what that plot is. So the outcomes led doesn't really involve me producing lots of worksheets. What it relies on is for me to understand which students need which level of outcome really in the classroom. Task-led is slightly different. Task-led is literally that they would be exposed to the same concept in terms of Macbeth. For example, we might be considering how Macbeth is seen in the first act, how he is portrayed, and how the other characters relate to him. But I might have different tasks available to students. So I may have a card sort. I may give that to begin with to everybody, but then what I might do is adapt those cards sorts so that some students have got a higher level cards or more cards to sort. Or what I might do is give all of the students the same cards, but give the most able students the task of finding quotes to match those card sorts. So there are different ways that I can adapt a task to enable all the students to have exposure to the same curriculum, but at a different in a different way. The third aspect that I would suggest is through the text. Now, as an English teacher, what we're doing is we're trying to ensure that students are ready to sit GCSE literature and then move forward if they wanted to A-level. As a school, our view is that we help all the students to have that experience as they move forward. So picking the text is really key, because obviously as they go towards the GCSE papers, all of the students will be faced with extracts from the original text of Macbeth. And that's really, really tricky. And in my experience, no 14-year-old wants to pick up Macbeth anyway, in the sense of reading it as a pure text. So we have to really think about how we're engaging them, which text we're using, and what it is that we want to achieve from that. There, I've put on the screen here a couple of different versions of Macbeth that we use in our classrooms. So we've got the original text, the No Fear Shakespeare, which gives you the original text alongside a modern version. Then you've got the Orchard text as well. So really here, what we would do is look at all the students understanding the story, understanding the narrative and the characters, but we might give them an opportunity to see that through the Orchard text to begin with. So they just get a quick summary of that. Then step them closer to that by giving them some support with No Fear Shakespeare before we did something with the original text. One of the things I would say is that in terms of choosing a text for students, I think it's really important to get the right one. There are oodles of texts out there, and it's why am I choosing this text for this class and why this text for this student? I think that's really key. You've got students who are in need of scaffolding and support to access a text. One of the really interesting things to bear in mind is that for a student to comprehend a text, they need to know 95% of the vocabulary. They need to be able to decode it. If they can't do that, then they're not going to have the full comprehension of the text. So therefore, choosing the right text to support them to understand the concepts that we're talking about is really key, but not making the text very low level. It's really important that they have high level text and we support them to access those. You can do that in a number.
Sorry, Sue, just 1 minute left.
That's okay, that's no problem. We can do that in a number of ways. We can do that through things like giving them pre-teaching of vocabulary, dual coding, where you give them an image and the text, or you can give them the opportunity to engage with that text in an active way where they are highlighting the text or having that discussion. I just wanted, the last thing I wanted to mention was really adaptive learning is about making learning exciting and engaging. So things like using mini whiteboards, using post-it notes, using highlighters really engages students. If we think of our world of tech, students can come into school in the morning and almost see 8 hours of PowerPoints. We need to find really engaging ways of getting students interested in what they're learning. And on the next slide, I've got here some examples of some students, different levels of ability of where they accessed Sherlock Holmes texts, but we did that in a really interesting way. They had big sheets of paper. We did lots of talking, lots of reading and exploring, and then this was the fruits of their labour. So you can see they've all done it at different levels, but they've all still understood the concept that we were talking about. So if there was one thing I wanted to leave you with, it was really get to know your students. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue. That was fantastic. And I'm going to pass over now to Priya. So if you just give me 1 second so I can add the spotlight. There we go. Over to you, Priya.
Thank you. So hello, everyone from New Jersey, USA, and thank you for inviting me. I am a professor of disability studies at Montclair State University here, and also I coordinate the inclusive education teacher education program. My background is in anti-ableist work and anti-ableist teaching in schools and systems of disrupting disability oppressions. So you can go to the next slide, Sharon. Okay, so I am going to take a little bit of a different approach or add a layer, if you will. I feel that it is necessary if we are going to engage in a conversation about inclusive education for students with disabilities to also engage with the question and the topic of ableism. It's almost like the elephant in the room. You know, we talk about inclusive education, but we leave this sometimes unaddressed or not talked about. So many of you, most of you might be familiar with the term ableism, but in case you're not, ableism generally refers to negative attitudes toward or the devaluing of individuals with disabilities. And more specifically, it's institutional policies and practices that end up being to the disadvantage of certain individuals, in this case, disabled individuals. It can manifest in numerous ways, hundreds of ways, of course, but lack of access being the most common. And more thought about is access, but less thought about is expectations in schools. Expectations that disabled people should move, learn, communicate, or interact in neuronormative ways or like non-disabled people. Go to the next slide, please, Sharon. Thank you. So when we look at ableism in the context of schooling, a lot of times it manifests as something called able-bodied or able-minded privilege. And what does that mean? This sort of ties into some of the things that you've heard so far from our speakers. But more broadly, this idea that our environments, our school environments, our classroom environments, our lessons, assignments, expectations of behavior, often they are set up in advance to the advantage of non-disabled people. Also, I put in parentheses, of course, and all dominant groups, right? White, middle class, heteronormative, and non-disabled students. So we set up the environment in a way that is already disadvantaged to some students. We've got to think about our hidden curriculum and the implicit messages that students are being given about the normative body, normative ways of moving, and normative ways of communicating. The littlest things, the ways in which we present the human body to our preschoolers. Sharon, yeah, thank you. For example, we have a popular song here that many preschools, you hear them sing, the 10 little fingers and 10 little toes. You know, you might know it, 2 little eyes and 1 little nose. We have 2 hands, 2 legs. And through these ways, we communicate to children what the normative body is, what the norm is, and those who are not are outside of it. We communicate also in small ways, normative ways of moving by saying things like, let's keep quiet hands, quiet bodies, sit still, hands to yourself. What does communication look like in school? We expect students to use our voices to say what we want, or look me in the eyes. And all of these sort of don't take into account that there are neurodiverse students there are neurodivergent students there, that some of these may not be fair for. So when we look at special education broadly, it's really a system that's focused on remediation, right? At its core, fixing the problem. But here's the question I want to leave you with. Where is the problem, quote unquote, problem located, right? Usually we locate the problem within individual students rather than in systems, institutional systems, and the ways in which our environments are set up. Next slide, please. So we just want to think about these things. Expectations of conduct are set up in ways that work for many neuronormative students. When students with Down syndrome are viewed as not complying with expectations in a general education classroom, the most common response is removal of that student from the classroom and placement in a separate class, right? We need to maybe rethink this and ask ourselves, perhaps what we are calling acting out behavior or non-compliant behavior or not listening behavior may actually be a result of lack of access to communication or other environmental barriers. Does the student have every access to being able to communicate their needs, likes, dislikes, or what is distressing them? So it might be reframed as a stress behavior rather than a non-compliant behavior. Go to the next slide. So what does real, authentic inclusivity look like for students with Down syndrome? And there I've taken the liberty, with my daughter's permission, to share that photo. That's her in, I think, 5th grade at a play that they did in their drama class. You can go to the next slide. So I'll start with what real inclusive, I shouldn't say the word real, but authentic, genuine, inclusive education does not look like, right? There's this idea, especially here in schools in New Jersey, I see this a lot, that if we place a child with Down syndrome in a general education classroom, that's inclusive education. In fact, inclusive education involves a provision. You have to actually do something. I like to say to people, inclusion is really a verb, right? To include means that you have to actually do something. You have to provide access. You have to provide supports, and not just supports in one area, but in the full breadth of learning, communication, interaction, access not just to the curriculum, but access to forming meaningful relationships with others in the classroom. So we really need to, in the second bullet point, I ask you to consider, if we are placing a student in a system that is exclusionary by design, it cannot be called inclusive, right? Inclusive education really requires a restructuring of your space. We heard about that with our wonderful first 2 speakers. and our pedagogical restructuring, our lessons, our expectations, and so on. But here's the layer I want to add. All of that will still not be enough. If our interventions are focused solely on students with Down syndrome or any disability, which is great, which we should do all these things, but it's not going to be enough. It is also going to require educating the non-disabled students about disability. And it's also going to be about nurturing positive identities for everybody, and that includes positive disability identity for those in the classroom. Sharon, next slide. So I'm going to give you 3 things very briefly. Inclusive practices broadly include a school culture where all identities are valued, an anti-ableist pedagogy, and an anti-ableist curriculum. So I'll address each of these 3. So what does an disability inclusive school culture look like? And I'll speak for many, our system here, where we include multicultural curriculum, and it is sort of expected that a teacher will sort of nurture positive racial, cultural, ethnic, gender identities. However, often we forget that disability also is an identity marker, and that should also be cultivated, affirmed, and valued. So we want to acknowledge that in schools, openly and through our practices, that there are neurodivergent ways of participating in the world, and that's okay. There are different ways of communicating. Some people use devices to communicate. So disability and specific disabilities, in this case, we're talking about Down syndrome, need to be named, openly named, claimed, discussed, and positioned as valued aspects of students' identities and as people that are among us in the world. And in a minute, I'm going to give you some actual everyday curricular examples of how you can actually do that. So just bear with me. We need to consider whether our expectations may be unreasonable for certain students. We want to create spaces where there can be allyship and collective organizing and group identity. You can nurture disability pride. And one thing that I've done a lot of work with in schools is I work with students to invite them to identify barriers in their own classrooms and schools to inclusivity. That's a typo there, sorry. We also want to remember that we don't want to place the burden of educating people about disability on students with disabilities. We do that a lot, right? And generally in the world. However, having said that, we also want to provide opportunities for those who do wish to share their lived experience, to share with the class. And I say this as a mother. As Sharon said earlier, I also do have a young lady with Down syndrome now that went through the school system in an inclusive setting all the way through. And frequently she wished to and wanted to share about Down syndrome to her friends, her peers. Next slide. So what does an anti-ableist pedagogy look like? For the first level is setting up the environment in ways that do not disadvantage some students. That looks like providing access to learning, access to communication. Perhaps students need an alternative and augmentative communication device. Perhaps that looks like something as simple as an iPad app. Sometimes it may be a more complex technology device so that they can communicate. Remind yourselves that oral communication is not the only way that people can communicate. There's so many ways, picture boards, visual communications and technology and so forth. Providing obviously the necessary adaptations for the individual child. And that doesn't mean having your standard 3 levels of accommodations or of differentiated worksheets, but it really means looking at each student and saying, how can I take this and make it meaningful for the student? And then in terms of behavior, we want to ask ourselves, why are we doing this intervention? Is there any reason for it? Is it hurting anyone? If a child needs to flap or move or twirl or get up, is there really, I mean, maybe it's helping them to learn better. So sometimes interventions are actually not to the benefit of students with disabilities, but rather to the benefit of the teacher or the non-disabled students to keep a sense of order or have this illusion of order, perhaps. So I want to put out there this idea of universal design for learning, UDL, which you may be familiar with. But it's this idea of, instead of having your lessons and then trying to adapt it to fit the student, maybe think proactively and develop your curriculum and your lessons and your environments in ways proactively that have many possible ways to approach it. Next slide. Anti-ableist curriculum. What does this look like? This looks like a curriculum in which disability is understood and is part of the curriculum, much in the same way as a multicultural education isn't a one-day check off the box, but rather throughout the curriculum, we include the experiences or the writings and representation of all groups. So when we look at that concept in terms of disability, we look at what our curriculum has, and there are many natural places within our curriculum already. They exist to infuse the topic of disability and specifically Down syndrome, and allow students to ask the questions they have, to learn about it. And here I've included a picture of a project that I did at my daughter's, I think it was 4th grade classroom. It was an inquiry project on disability, disability justice. I mean, heavy topics, but at a 4th grade level, it was a fantastic project. And the girls that you see over here have their poster board on the topic of Down syndrome and the history of Down syndrome, segregation in schools, and what inclusion looks like. So this is stuff that they investigated with support, and my daughter was part of that group. Next slide. So I promised that I would have some actual tangible examples of how we can infuse lessons about disability in our curriculum. And here are some examples. You have social studies, natural opportunity to talk about the disability rights movement when you're talking about civil rights movements, and learn about disability culture when you're learning about cultures across the world. In math, it allows many opportunities, actually. When I work with students, they always say to me, oh, we can include this stuff, but in math, how can we possibly talk about disability when we're doing math? But actually, you can create a math lesson on accessibility. You can learn about the laws on what a doorway, how wide a doorway needs to be, what your school needs to have. And then you can have your students actually do an accessibility project using math concepts, right? Count, measure the heights of sinks, count how many accessible parking spots there are, plot the data, create graphs, and just have a lot of fun with it. I've used all of these lessons in schools. Students that I worked with created an accessibility report based on their data, and they wrote about it, and they wrote a letter about it to school officials. And in science, when you're teaching genetics, you can learn about the eugenics movement. You can learn about perfect opportunity to learn about genetic variations like Down syndrome. And I will give you a really quick example of something that was a little bit upsetting to me and my daughter when she was in science class and learning about genetics. She came home with a worksheet or something that stated that she had brought home, a take-home handout that said all humans have 23 pairs of chromosomes, 23 times 2 equals 46. And it confounded me that the teacher had looked my daughter in the eye and handed her a paper that said all humans have 23 pairs of chromosomes, when he was looking at one that didn't. And my daughter knew this to be true. So she brought it home and said, I encouraged her gently to make the edit and take it back to the teacher. And the simple edit was, most humans have 23 pairs of chromosomes.
Got just 1 minute left, Priya.
Yeah, I'm wrapping up. And so here's plenty of examples for you. You can learn about robotic technology. Children nowadays love social media and apps and these kinds of things. You can bring that all in, read memoirs of disabled activists, learn about ASL poetry, I'm saying ASL, that's American Sign Language, I'm sorry, BSL for British Sign Language. And persuasive letters can be part of your language arts lesson. Next slide, Sharon, and I'll wrap it up. Here are just some more ideas. I won't go through all of them, but it's really important. Representation matters. Children with Down syndrome, students with Down syndrome, or any disability need to have representation in the curriculum and their identity valued, because that is part of inclusivity. If I'm being included in a classroom, but who I am cannot be mentioned, then I'm not really being included. And these are ideas. And yeah, thanks, Sharon, I see what you put in the chat. There's hundreds of ideas in my book, Undoing Ableism. So it really lays out how we can create fully inclusive classrooms by inviting students with disabilities to be part of the learning experience by sharing also their own lived experiences. And here are just some examples. All of these I've actually tried out and engaged in with young people from, second grade to high school. In fact, if anyone does see the book Undoing Ableism, the cover of the book, just FYI, is the winner of the poster contest on disability. It was a poster contest on disability history in a high school, and the students were told that the winner of the poster contest would get to be the cover of the book. So the students get really, really into it and excited. And such, you create a community of allies and peers for students with disabilities. And that creates an environment of acceptance that needs to be the starting place of everything. I think there's just one more slide with pictures of books. I thought it would be fun to just add in there. And
thank you.
That's
thank
it.
you so much. If you could put a link in the chat to your book, I'm sure people would be very grateful.
Okay. Let me look for that.
Let me just move our slides on. Okay, so we've got a few questions now. We're going to do this sort of maybe 10, 15 minutes, possibly maximum, because we've got 5 questions also for the panel from the attendees as well. So these are just some questions, maybe objections to differentiation or adaptations, or just, adding a little bit more depth to the things you've already talked about. But what I'm really interested in now is to get a discussion going between you. So where, to hear different views on the same question, because you've all presented your own different sections. So we've got questions about how do you find the time to do this if you're a busy teacher, and we do know that teachers have got a lot of pressures on them. So how do you find the time to do that? What is the key to inclusion or adaptation for a pupil who's working at a significantly different level to the rest of the class? So we know that the gap between pupils who have Down syndrome and typically developing pupils will get bigger as they go through the school career. How does adaptation benefit more than just the one child, if if we're differentiating the curriculum. And the last one is, why is it so important to incorporate disability or to infuse disability within the curriculum? I really liked the word infuse. So I'm going to open the floor to the panelists, and I don't know who wants to go first or what question you'd like to answer.
I don't mind talking about finding the time to adapt. It's interesting because I was talking to a colleague today and we were looking at what does our timetable really look like as classroom teachers. So in a secondary school, a classroom teacher for us can teach 30 periods a week, which means that you've got a number of different classes that you're actually seeing across a number of different year groups. And you can see anywhere up to, if each one of those has got 30 students in it, anywhere up to 240 students in a week. So this is a really interesting question for us. How do we find the time? And I think it's about ensuring that adaptation is seen to be a pedagogical strategy that you use on a day-to-day basis, and can be seen in its widest form, really. So the fact that I've got a set of pens that are there for students, or I've got a set of mini whiteboards that are there for students, they are just things that are in the classroom that you can then pull on. So I don't actually have to sit down before the lesson and plan individual strategies for every single one of those students across the week. What I need is a range of strategies available to me as a class teacher that I can pull on for students, I think. And I think that's where we find the time. It becomes almost like changing gear in a car. You get to know the student and what the student needs. So you set up, for example, those whiteboards so that they're always available for them, or those sets of cards with individual words so they're always available to them. So you might put that time in right at the beginning, but actually, as you move forward and as you get familiar with that student, those things become automatic, I think.
So is this and this is to all of you, is this a move away from having different worksheets for different pupils at different levels? Is there a role for worksheets? I can see there's some nodding and smiles.
I mean, for me as a classroom teacher who's been doing this for a little while, I think the difference between differentiation and adaptation is that historically, differentiation was seen that we had to have 3 different levels of worksheet in a classroom. They had to be set out very different, and that was time heavy before a lesson. Now I think what we see is that we teach children, so the adaptation is more about what's right for them within the classroom and how can we do that. So it's not that we don't ever use worksheets, it's that if I use a worksheet, it might be, for example, with the Macbeth, I might have an extract from Macbeth on a worksheet, and I might ask students to do something different with that. So then in my head, they're all getting access to the same text, but they may do it in a slightly different way.
Yeah,
that's what I think.
I'd like to also piggyback on that. And I think, well put, Sue. I mean, I think it's a move away from a boilerplate sort of, here are 3 different worksheets kind of thing. Of course, there's places for worksheets. But I think what Sharon might be saying is, it's not like you create these 3 and then try to fit all your students into these 3 levels. I think it means, as Sue was saying, you sort of, it may seem bottom, not, I don't know what the word is, not top heavy or whatever, but you put in the work beforehand. But again, that doesn't mean creating your 3 and then your work is done. Mm-hmm. It's proactive design, as I was saying, with the universal design for learning. You create a lesson in advance that has many possible ways. They might visually, they might want to draw it, they might, so you would create that proactively. But having said that, again, to reiterate it, it may also mean coming back to it after, because there's a particular student and you say, okay, I don't have anything created here, but like, what does this student need? What, and you just think creatively. I think sometimes we're just afraid as educators, and we think that there's something that we're supposed to know or have done, and now the lesson is in action, and I don't have anything for the student's not getting it. It can seem a little bit scary, but I'm telling you, just dispel of that fear and just ask yourself, here's a student. Okay, what how do they want to approach this? Maybe they can do this. Yeah, I'll give you a real quick example. My daughter is in high school and she's in a drama class. And for the final exam, they must memorize a monologue from Shakespeare to go off the Shakespeare examples, right? Any Shakespearean monologue, that has been the tradition at Montclair High School. The parents come, everyone in the community is invited, and everyone performs their final exam is a Shakespearean monologue. My daughter is doing really well in the class, but there is no way. She is anxious. She comes home. She's like, I can't. Remember, Sue said the 90% of the vocabulary needs to be understood. Those words meant nothing. Those monologues meant nothing. The teacher, who was wonderful, was trying everything and was communicating with me. And I've asked her to select any kind of monologue she wants. I gave her easier monologues. I gave her monologues that are written by somebody else. I don't know, Yeats. None of it. So I went in there and we're trying to troubleshoot this, all of us. And then he just looks at me and he says, well, let me ask her, what does she like? Who does she like to read and listen to? And she said, Lady Gaga. And he said, would you like to perform a monologue of her lyrics? And she said, yes, I do that. I do that. I enjoy doing that. And she memorized a spoken word performance of Born This Way for her final exam. I mean, it wasn't sung, it was a spoken, performed piece. And that's just, if I can offer that as an example of how that teacher taught, and he kept saying, but Shakespeare is the tradition here at our high school, until he finally realized, well, maybe it doesn't have to be Shakespeare.
Absolutely. So we do have some questions. I mean, we could carry on talking about these, but I've seen we do have some questions, and there's a couple of other comments and questions in the chat too. So I'm very aware of time, and I want to make sure anybody who's attended has the opportunity to ask the question. So we've got a question from somebody who's posted anonymously, which, by the way, is absolutely fine to do. Can a child who has Down syndrome, who is age 8 to 10, they are high functioning, also has autism spectrum disorder and ADHD, currently not being taught in a mainstream classroom, is it possible to reintegrate that child back into an inclusive classroom? The child has got good spoken vocabulary, and it says that they can see and hear. So I'm assuming no significant visual or hearing impairments. Any thoughts? I'm going to ask Jill if she wants to answer that one first.
Well, it's I don't know the child, I don't know the situation, so I don't want to say anything hard and fast, but I would have thought so with some creative thinking. I don't know what's led to that situation either. I've got all sorts of things popping through my head. I can remember one child who had both of those things, actually, although they weren't diagnosed till much later. But but he was in the class, but he had it was like he didn't appreciate the rest of the class being there, and he liked the teacher at the front talking to him. And if there were any questions, he wanted to be answering them all the time. And there were some behaviours that happened that could be quite serious, actually. I won't say what those are. If he got annoyed because other people were being asked to answer their questions. And we did a game for a while where he, as a learning exercise really, where he sat to the side with support, and the game was to see who was on, to actually watch what was going on between the teacher and all of the others in the class, to see that other children said things, and actually he could tell you who was answering, and just give him more insight into what's going on in that classroom, and that helped. But I don't know what that helped a lot, actually, because he appreciated the others were there too. Yeah, but I don't, I think I'd need to find out in more detail what's happening there, and also what the pupil likes. We'd have to know, wouldn't we? What does he really like? I mean, it sounds like a hard old day out of class, missing all of that interaction.
So we do have an information helpline at the Down Syndrome Association, where we might be able to give some specific advice and suggestions for individual cases. And so I'll just plug that quickly, but there is a slide with that on later on.
Can I
Yes.
just add also, and I'm certain that I'm coming from a different educational system and different, I guess, laws and whatever, but I genuinely believe that inclusive education is a civil right of all children. Now, having said that, as Jill said, I don't know what has happened that has led to this child being segregated. But I think that anytime we remove a child from a general education setting, the goal actually always should be, how do we bring the child back? I mean, removal may have been in response to something, but I genuinely think it's our ethical responsibility to think of how that child, not whether, but how that child can eventually be brought back to his or her natural community of peers.
Yeah, thank you. So I've got a few more questions. I'll open this to all of you, because you may all have a view on it. If for a secondary age student who is 13 years old, so year 9 in UK terms, has a much lower level of cognitive understanding. So, for instance, might be working at early infant school level, so maybe age 5 level. Would it be good to use tools for a younger child?
Right.
Who'd like to go? Jill.
Yeah, that's not. Yeah. Oh, sorry. That's not unusual at all. Yeah, quite common actually. And in a way, you already are using tools. I mean, if you think of, if you're having more engaging work, if you're creating it to look more engaging, to be more engaging, that is a tool for a younger child. Lift the flap things, and like going a level further with what Sue said about her strategies in class. If you had printed characters of all the Macbeth characters, or a couple of those out on the desk, so that people could pull on those, and you could get those done in advance by somebody else if you were really set up to do that. Yeah, I lost losing the track. Those would be tools for younger children, but without meaning you have to do lessons for, activities, and that you're totally separated off. So there would be tools. Sorry, other people.
Can I just say, I think actually as a secondary teacher, there's nothing wrong with looking to the primary sector for the strategies and resources that they use. I think they're really, really good. And we do that quite a lot. Some of the texts that I showed for Macbeth come from, their lower level reading. So we use a lot of things from the primary sector for our students.
And I agree. I mean, but it's a fine line. Yeah, you can use tools like Jillian and Sue are saying, but use them in a way like the simple tool of drawing. Yes, it's a primary sector tool, right? You can say, do a pictorial representation of the answer, or you can. I have an example of. I think a teacher did a photosynthesis or plant cycle that the students in the class were having to write a paragraph about it, and teacher created like a way of like drawing a plant, and then the student had to just pick the parts and stick, stick leaf, root, stem, flower, so that's sticking on a paper. That's a tool. Of course it's a tool. Yeah. But remember that while you can use that tool, you're still on the same curricular topic.
Yeah.
A poor example would be, and I've seen this, the class is learning photosynthesis, and they've asked this child with Down syndrome to color Teletubbies in the corner. So here's your tool. They're both tools. They're coloring and drawing, but right, you can say, use this tool to represent your answer. Or, oh, this is going to be too hard for you. Why don't you do some coloring here while your friends finish the work? Right? So yeah, use the tool, but keep it on topic and not a stigmatized, childish activity, but simply just another way to access that activity, if that makes any sense.
Perfect. Thank you. Okay, so a question saying, would you recommend talking about diversity and difference, and talk about observing differences and similarities within student groups, such as how many pupils wear glasses, how many like sport, hair colours, etc., to be talking about disability in that way? The person who's posted this question says her daughter is the only person who has Down syndrome in the whole school, and currently her daughter doesn't want to feel different. And I think that's a really interesting tension, isn't it? And I know somebody earlier put in the chat that at their school they do assemblies about Down syndrome. But if you have just one child who has Down syndrome in the school, that can be quite challenging for that child. So I don't know how you want to address that tension. Who'd like to take that one?
Well, I'm happy to take it.
Okay.
Since I brought up. So yeah, it can be a little. So first thing, I should have said, if you're singling out, talking about a particular disability, and there is only one, you want to have buy-in from the student. You want to have that conversation with them. You also want to be careful. You're not outing someone. I mean, in the case of Down syndrome, it's it's different. But certain disabilities are not visible disabilities, right? So you don't want to out people or highlight people or that kind of thing. So I actually like this question because within the question there's this sort of the answer, right? You wanna embed these kinds of topics within broader topics about differences. Right. So if I'm doing a unit on ways of moving, and we're looking at how people move, you can bring in that some people use wheels in a wheelchair, some people, use crutches, some people, I mean, put it, maybe you can include dance or sort of other quirky ways of moving or being in the world. Differences in how we look, right? Glasses, prosthetics, Down syndrome, color, shape, size, and so forth. So I always recommend bringing these conversations among bigger conversations about human differences. And I also want to say that, let's not forget that even if we don't mention it, students notice differences. They notice it anyway. So whether or not you've said it to them, they've noticed that a child looks different, that they are culturally different, and they have questions. They've stifled those questions because they've internalized and picked up that they're not supposed to ask certain kinds of things. So in fact, bringing it out there destigmatizes it and but it's also how you say it, right? If you are presenting Down syndrome as a point of positive difference, as opposed to, oh, some people have special needs and they learn differently, and we need to be nice to them. Remember to be kind. Instead, we might say, let's talk about different cultural groups. Did you know that deaf people consider themselves a culture? Let's learn about deaf culture. Let's learn about disability culture, and sort of frame it as a positive, valued identity. And again, you'd have, if there was one student, you might want to have a conversation with the family or the student and see if they're comfortable with the role in that. Sometimes students don't want to be highlighted. Sometimes students want to be positioned as the information giver so that they're not the person that everyone is looking at. It sort of gives them the power to say, hey, did you know? Here's some fun facts. It's sort of how you approach it.
Someone's just suggested through the Q&A, so I'm just going to read it out because other people won't see it, saying you could highlight the achievements of different people who are disabled. Absolutely. I think we have to be careful with that we don't end up in the sort of super crip, hero narratives. But absolutely, if there's that authentic discussion about what is possible and what people have gone on to achieve, and having that representation and role models. I don't know if anybody's got any thoughts on that. We've got a couple more questions that I want to get through otherwise.
No, I think that's a great idea. And also, I just thought of this, but taking the spotlight off the child, you might bring a guest speaker in with a particular disability, and the spotlight is on them. And they're not a hero. They're just your local mailman or, a police officer, like somebody who's coming in, right, to your school and talking about, hey, I want to talk to you about this disability that I have. So it's about representation. And that way also they see that disabled people are not just some hero that I've heard about in a textbook, but hey, this guy I didn't know. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So we've got a question here saying, how much additional time would you estimate a teacher would need to plan in adaptations to their lessons? It feels like the national curriculum prescribes teaching a very high level concepts, and it's hard to pull out aspects that would be accessible for a child who has Down syndrome. So identifying appropriate learning outcomes, identifying vocabulary, making visuals to support understanding of that, thinking of practical ways to show and teach, and so on. I feel like teachers want to do all these things but don't have the time. So it would be helpful to have an estimate of how much time should a teacher dedicate to this. I'm going to look at Sue initially, but then feel free to jump in, anybody else.
I think the place I would start with that is actually in terms of the national curriculum, what we're delivering is the curriculum for all the students, regardless of who they are and what challenges they have. So really, when we're planning sessions, when we're planning lessons, we should be looking at, okay, the national curriculum is telling me what to cover. What is it that I want my students to learn by the end of this scheme of learning? And then to plan backwards, because you look at where you want them to be at the end of that learning, you look at who they are and where they are now, and then your path for that will, your path towards that end point will really develop as you are teaching them along the way. And an example of that is I've taught Macbeth for many years. Lots of people say, well, you must literally use the same planning each year. No, we don't. And the reason we don't is because the children are different every year. It's really difficult to say that's going to take you an hour, that's going to take you half an hour. What I would say is if you use feedback constantly in the classroom and you use the opportunities to observe students and to talk to them and to listen to them, it all becomes part of your formative assessment. So you're watching and you're understanding your class at the point at which they're learning. So really your planning for the next lesson should be reduced because you know where they need to go in terms of the curriculum coverage next. The adaptations will be things like, okay, all the students in the class are looking at this extract. For that child over there, I might need to give them just an insight into a couple of the words that we're going to use tomorrow in this lesson. And then that actually, in terms of planning, is quite fast. It's not that you're spending hours planning materials. It's really about thinking about different strategies you can use rather than different materials. And I think that would reduce the amount of time.
Thanks, Sue. Did anybody have anything to add to that?
Only thinking of economies of scale. If it's resource, if you think about resource creation, not the really clever thing, which is thinking and planning. If you're making good resources, then they're not usually lesson by lesson. They could be used for all sorts of lessons. Certainly, if it's a topic or a theme. So try and think of it that way. I once knew ahead who had volunteers in every week and had all our orders from all the teachers, and they made all the resources. It was good.
I think one of the people mentioned earlier, one of the participants mentioned earlier, that it's got more difficult because you've got bigger class sizes, you've got less LSAs available to support you, and that's true. I think that is all true, and I think that's why some of the ideas for differentiation, whilst producing resources is really important and having high quality resources is really important, I think it's how you facilitate that learning in the classroom is really the adaptation. I think that's where it comes, and I think that's, you don't need as much time for that, I think.
Thank you. I'm very aware of time, and I like to be a stickler for time and try to finish on time. And I've got a couple more slides that I need to share. So I'm going to thank our speakers today. It's been a really interesting session. I'm going to apologise to the attendees that have asked questions that we didn't get to. And there were some in the chat, and there's a couple left in the Q&A. We will find a way of responding to those. But before you go, please don't go yet. Let me just share my screen very, very quickly before you head off. So we've done that. As we mentioned at the beginning, or Jill mentioned, we have been developing an education project where we have, over the last year, been adding lots of new resources to the Down Syndrome Association website. And we will be emailing all of you after this session with the link to that. But if any of you wanted to capture that link now, there's a QR code here, so quickly get your phones out. There are some recordings from previous webinars that we have run and recorded that are available on there, but there is a whole range of information about topics that have come up today. Priya helped write one about including disability in the curriculum. We've got resources about behaviour. I just saw a question about behaviour. We have resources about including children who have Down syndrome in the whole life of the school, so extracurricular activities and other things too, residential trips and sports days and all of those sorts of things. And it is something we're constantly working on. We will be doing some further follow-up webinars too. We'd suggest, again, on this link, you can sign up to our education database to be informed of those, to make sure that you know what else is coming up. What else are we doing? Oh yes, so one of the things we will be doing at some point, hopefully in the not too distant future, is we're wanting to create some spaces where we can bring together teachers to be talking to each other, sharing best practice ideas, but also getting advice from each other as well, that sort of peer-to-peer support. So if you are interested in that, again, please do let us know. It's still in the very early stages of development at the moment. We have got, oh, this is my daughter. This is a picture of my daughter who has Down syndrome. I didn't mention that at the beginning. We've got a helpline that is available for you to use. You can see that there's a telephone helpline and an email helpline, and the information team would be really happy to engage with your inquiries. But they can give more individual support and signposting depending on the topics that you're contacting them. That helpline is not just for DSA members. So if you're a teacher or a school leader or a SENCO watching this and you have some questions, please do contact the helpline. We would be really, really happy to help you. We also have got a feedback link. If you could spare a few minutes to tell us what you think of this webinar. We are constantly learning. We are trying to put on more events like this, and also to develop our training offering as well. So we're really keen to hear from you as to whether this worked for you, whether you'd like more of this, whether you want something different, because we're wanting to be as supportive as possible. Again, this feedback link will be sent out to you on email. And we are there to support people who have Down syndrome from birth to old age. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and say thank you again. We've run over by 1 minute, so I do apologise for anybody who has to rush off. But we will have a look through the chat, and we will have a look at the questions and answers we didn't get to. And as I say, we will find a way to respond to those as well. So thank you for joining us this evening. We hope it's been useful. And again, thank you to Jill, Sue and Priya for giving up your time as well to come and support this event. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.